Now let's look at how you control your breathing. We know that you can have voluntary control when you want to. Let's focus though on the medulla oblongata and that autopilot that you use most of the time. So you can see that right here is your medulla oblongata. So your medulla oblongata is controlling your breathing most of the time. Well, if it's going to control your breathing, it needs information. It has to have a way to decide what it should do with your breathing. So first, let's look at the information that your medulla oblongata uses to determine how much you should breathe. Okay, so the blue lines in this picture are the information. And we're actually going to start with this box right here is number 1. This box is your central chemoreceptor. And as we go through these, they should be very familiar to you. It's the exact same things that we used for blood pressure. Remember, medulla oblongata is regulating blood pressure. It's the same information, or at least some of it is. Here you have, in this pink part here, carbon dioxide in your blood. Well, cerebrospinal fluid is made from your blood. So whatever carbon dioxide is in your blood, the same amount ends up in your cerebrospinal fluid. And remember, carbon dioxide forms acid. So the carbon dioxide of your cerebrospinal fluid determines the pH of it. So if you don't remember this from chapter 3, you definitely need to go back and remember that. Whenever you mix carbon dioxide with water, you get carbonic acid. This dissociates to give you bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. And because we have a hydrogen ion, we have acid, and acid lowers your pH. So the relationship between carbon dioxide and pH is that the more carbon dioxide you have, the lower your pH. Okay, that's going to be very important. So our first piece of information is pH of cerebrospinal fluid. And this is detected by your central chemoreceptor. It's called central because it's right there in your brain. It's this part right here. Okay, number 2 is your peripheral chemoreceptors. So think back to chapter 20. We covered these already. They are right here in your carotid and here in your aorta. So these are number 2. And they detect the pH, carbon dioxide, and oxygen of your blood. Then the third one we have right up here is if you have any irritants, like something gets in your nose or gets in your throat and is going to make you sneeze or cough. If you remember back to chapter 13, learning about the brain and the medulla oblongata, it's in charge of coughing, sneezing, and gagging. So if you have an irritant and you're going to sneeze or cough, you have to first take a deep breath. Pay attention the next time you sneeze. Right before you sneeze, you take a deep breath. So you have to take a deep breath to sneeze or cough and clear your airway. Okay. The fourth one is here. This is baroreceptors in your lungs. Okay, think back to chapter 16. We talked about baroreceptors. Also in chapter 20, they detect stretch. They will let you know if you are taking too deep a breath and overstretch your lungs. Okay, so if they start signaling, then your medulla oblongata is going to ease back on the breathing. And the fifth one here is proprioceptors. In your muscles and joints. Okay, these you may recall we covered them before. They detect movement and body position. This is where if you close your eyes and touch your nose, you're using your proprioceptors. They're the ones that know where all your body parts are. They tell your medulla oblongata if you're resting or active. Okay, so that's the information. The blue lines here are all representing information that's going to your medulla oblongata. Now notice we have a couple of red lines. So let's look at those red lines and see what they're doing. So the red lines are these signals to your skeletal muscle, telling them to make you inhale and exhale. Okay, so you're basically either going to breathe more or breathe less. So let's match up breathing more or breathing less with our information here. So we can lump 1 and 2 together. Okay, and remember the relationship between carbon dioxide and pH. So if pH is too low, that means you have too much carbon dioxide. So you need to breathe more to get rid of it. Okay, then also, if carbon dioxide is too high, because you do have a carbon dioxide receptor there, then you will breathe more to get rid of it. Okay, with the oxygen, in a normal healthy person, you're not going to use the oxygen receptor. It's only used where there's lung disease, and we're going to talk about that later. So the oxygen receptor only responds to very low oxygen. In a healthy person, your oxygen wouldn't get low enough to set off that receptor. So we're going to wait and talk about it in a little bit. Okay, so the irritants, remember we said that you have to take a deep breath so that you can sneeze or cough to clear them. Okay, the baroreceptors, if you're overstretching your lungs, you want to breathe less. You don't want to overstretch your lungs and then tear them. And with the proprioceptors, so think back to chapter 3, use that information. If you are active, that means you're going to use more ATP. And every time you make ATP, you also make carbon dioxide. And if you're making more carbon dioxide, then you need to breathe more to get rid of it. So the main thing that you're doing here with like 1 and 2 and 5, these are all about homeostasis of carbon dioxide and pH. Keeping those things right. And remember with pH, you want to stay at 7.4. Okay, so now let's move on. And I said we would talk about that low oxygen situation. Okay, first of all, let's look at the healthy person. So here in the yellow, this is a healthy person. Okay, so this is the cycle we just talked about. You would have, if you had increased carbon dioxide in the blood and cerebral spinal fluid, that's going to stimulate your receptors, and you're going to increase your breathing, and that's going to remove the carbon dioxide, and you're going to go back to normal. So you're going to maintain homeostasis, because you're detecting that carbon dioxide, you're breathing more to remove it, and then you're back to normal. And although this picture doesn't show it, you're also detecting pH. That's very important. So just by monitoring your pH and your carbon dioxide, you can keep everything at homeostasis. Okay, the green one here shows a person who has disease. And this is especially emphysema. And you can see there they've got emphysema as kind of the main one here. If you have emphysema, you can't exhale effectively. Air becomes trapped in the lungs. Well, because you can't exhale effectively, this means that carbon dioxide becomes trapped in your blood. Okay, so then think about what happens to carbon dioxide level. If it's trapped in your blood, the level becomes high. So you have high carbon dioxide, which would also mean that you have low pH. And this is chronic, right? You can't exhale, you can't get that carbon dioxide out. It's just trapped, and you just always have high carbon dioxide and low pH. Okay, With this situation, think back about type 2 diabetes, how you wore out your receptors with the high insulin. The same thing happens. This wears out the receptors. If it's chronically high for the carbon dioxide and chronically low for the pH, those receptors are working so hard trying to tell your medulla oblongata, and eventually they just get worn out because they constantly have to work hard. So now they don't work anymore. So you can see here, you have high carbon dioxide, but you get no increase in respiration. So because these receptors are worn out, your CO2 and pH levels no longer stimulate your medulla oblongata to increase your breathing. So you're sitting here, you have high carbon dioxide and low pH, but you don't breathe more to fix it. Because you wore out the receptors. So that means the problem just gets worse. And while the problem with your carbon dioxide is getting worse, your oxygen levels are dropping. So notice here, marked decrease in oxygen levels. Well, now your oxygen can actually drop low enough that you stimulate those receptors that only respond to very low oxygen. So now you finally get a signal, you get some working receptors, because remember, in a healthy person, you're not using those receptors. So you've gone your whole life until you got emphysema, not using these receptors really. So they're all fresh and new yet. So they work just fine, and they stimulate the breathing, and you get increased breathing. Okay, but here's the catch. So this is called hypoxic drive. Hypoxic means low oxygen. So remember, those receptors only respond if your oxygen is very low. So hypoxic drive means that you rely on very low oxygen to stimulate breathing. And if your oxygen level gets too high, you'll stop breathing. So this is why if you have someone with emphysema and they have oxygen, you can't turn it up too high. If you turn it up and you give them too much oxygen, they'll actually stop breathing. So hypoxic drive, you're relying on keeping your oxygen very low in order to stimulate you to breathe. Okay, Now we can look at the airway part. So that was controlling the skeletal muscles, making you inhale and exhale. Now let's look at the ANS and your airway diameter. So remember, this is going to be how much air you bring in and out with each breath. And it's also controlled by the medulla oblongata. And it uses the same information. So all the stuff we have back up here in blue, the information, you're going to use that same information. So we don't have to go through that again. Just review that blue part with the information you're using. Okay, so if we come down here, you have your two options, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So we know that this is parasympathetic, and this one is sympathetic. Okay, so parasympathetic is going to be if your pH, so now think it through. With parasympathetic, that's your rest and digest, you're going to end up breathing less, which means you'll retain carbon dioxide and you'll lower your pH. So this is the one you use if pH is high. And if pH is high, that means carbon dioxide is low. Okay, so if your pH is high or your carbon dioxide is low, then you will have your vagus nerve will secrete acetylcholine onto your airways, and they will constrict. If they constrict, this means you will get less air moving in and out with each breath. So this means you will retain carbon dioxide. And if you retain carbon dioxide, then your CO2 goes up and your pH goes down. And this is what you do when you are resting. Okay, remember, we went over this back in chapter 3. When you're resting, you have low ATP production, which means you have low carbon dioxide production. Okay, and remember we talked about, if you think about your blood as a bucket, your cells make ATP, and when they do, they put carbon dioxide in. Then your lungs take carbon dioxide out, and they have to be equal. As long as the amount your lungs take out equals the amount your cells put in, your pH will stay at 7.4. So when you're resting, you're using parasympathetic to constrict the airways. That way you don't accidentally lose too much carbon dioxide and then upset your blood pH. Okay, sympathetic would be if pH is too low. If pH is too low, that means your carbon dioxide is high. So in this case, you would use norepinephrine, which would bind to beta receptors. And that is going to cause the smooth muscle to dilate or to relax, and your airways will dilate. So now you will get more air with each breath, and you will lose that carbon dioxide. So now your carbon dioxide will come down. You will reduce your carbon dioxide, which will raise your pH, and you will come back to homeostasis. And this is what you do when you are active. Because remember, that bucket again, when you're active, your cells make more ATP. Which means you have more carbon dioxide going into the blood. So you need to dilate those airways so you can get more carbon dioxide out so that you can maintain homeostasis. Okay, then just like when we talked about the heart and blood pressure, there are drugs that manipulate your receptors. We have that here with your respiratory system. So the first one here is an EpiPen. So if you think about this, think about epi. The epi in EpiPen stands for epinephrine. So this is simulating your sympathetic. The same thing down here, this is a rescue inhaler. Okay, and it contains albuterol. Okay, both of these medicines work in the same way. They both mimic norepinephrine. So that is called being an agonist. They are both norepinephrine agonists. So they will both bind to the beta receptor. Now, back in we were talking about the heart, we talked about beta blockers, something that binds to the beta receptor and blocks it, prevents norepinephrine. But here, they're a norepinephrine mimic. So when they bind to the beta receptor, you get the same result as if norepinephrine were doing it. So they're not blocking, they're stimulating. Your body can't tell the difference between these medicines and its own norepinephrine. So it's like somebody copies the key to your house and then they can unlock the door. That's what's happening here. The EpiPen is used to treat an allergic reaction. If you have a really, really bad, severe allergic reaction, you'll go into anaphylactic shock. The airways start closing up. So an allergy can cause the airways to close. So you take the EpiPen and you mimic sympathetic. And we know that sympathetic makes the airways dilate. So when you use that EpiPen, you get that medicine that binds to the beta receptors in the airways, and they dilate, and then you can breathe again. And this is common, like peanut allergies are common, bee sting allergies, anything where somebody could have a severe reaction, and they carry an EpiPen. The rescue inhaler is used in asthma. So this mimics sympathetic in an asthma attack. Because in an asthma attack, the airways are closing up and it's hard to breathe. So you take the rescue inhaler, it goes in there, binds to those beta receptors, your body thinks it's norepinephrine, and then the airways open back up. So there's where we can use our knowledge of the neurotransmitters and the hormones and the receptors and make medicines to mimic the or to alter the physiology.